Well, I came to Oregon in 1980. And what I recall is that when I told my friends I was moving to Oregon, my black friends particularly, they were kind of horrified because what they said to me was, well, there've never been any blacks in Oregon, they don't have any blacks in Oregon now, and they don't want blacks in Oregon. You'll see, you'll be back. Well, that was a long time ago, and maybe if I had known then what I know now, likely I wouldn't have come to Oregon, because Oregon's history is pretty sordid when it comes to people of color.
It's astounding to me that as a kid raised in Oregon schools, Oregon public schools, a graduate of Willamette University, that I knew almost nothing about the racial history of Oregon. I was one of those who sort of felt with pride that as I've traveled around the world and around the country, that in Oregon, we've always been really good to minorities. We've had so little prejudice. And yet, as I got into these stories, I discovered that we've had as much of a racist history as just about any other place in the country. We've had slavery, we've had exclusion laws, we've had laws that have passed against black, we've had sundown laws in communities throughout the area, and yet these are not mentioned in Oregon history.
The most ancient shoes ever discovered were unearthed in a cave in Fort Rock, Oregon in 1938. Predating Christ, the Babylonian Empire, and even Moses, the sandals slept beneath a protective layer of volcanic ash for over 11,000 years. Woven together from local sagebrush, they told the archaeologists the story of a lost ancient paradise.
The wearer of these sandals did not look out on swirling dust devils or miles of alkali and sandflats as we did that hot August day, but on a great lake with wavelets lapping against a beach below the cave.
Weathering in winters in the caves and swimming in the lake through the long, hot summers, these ancient Oregonians were some of the earliest seeds of the flourishing native tribes that would explode to 50,000 people over the next 10 millennia. Cayuse, Chinook, Coquel, Coos, Shasta, Kalapuya, Klamath, Malala, Nez Perce, Takelma, Tillamook, Umatilla, Umpqua. Stretching all along the Oregon coast, overflowing the Columbia Gorge, and dotting the many lakes and waterways of the state, a colorful matrix of cultures, religions, trade routes, governments, and ways of life had evolved throughout the Oregon Territory by the late 1700s, when the first white explorers began arriving. The most famous explorers of the Oregon Territory were Lewis and Clark, deployed by President Jefferson on a 2.5-year mission from Missouri to the Pacific Ocean and back.
The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams of it as, by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, may offer the most direct and practical water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce.
They returned home in 1806 without the sought-after Northwest Passage waterway, but with the discovery of 2 passages through the Rocky Mountains. With the white settlers came the deadliest enemy native Oregonians would face: disease. Tens of thousands of warriors, women, and children were killed by smallpox, measles, and other European diseases. Entire tribes were annihilated, and others were so crippled that their survivors were scattered and absorbed by other tribes. By the early 19th century, as much as 80% of the native population of Oregon was gone. But the Great White Migration had barely begun. Both of Lewis and Clark's passages through the Rocky Mountains were too perilous for wagons to cross. From 1811 to 1840, traders, trappers, and missionaries slowly blazed the Oregon Trail, but it was still only possible to navigate it on foot or horseback. In 1836, the first wagon made its way across the plains and through the Rockies, arriving at Fort Hall, Idaho. The number of pioneers heading west skyrocketed quickly: 70 in 1841, 100 in 1842, 1,000 in 1843. By the time the Great Migration was in full swing, the native population in the West was so devastated that there was hardly any resistance at all to the influx of white settlers, who brought with them deep-seated European entitlement, distrust, and prejudice.
They were the most uncouth-looking objects, and not strongly calculated to impress us with a favorable opinion of aboriginal beauty or the purity of Indian manners. A few of the men were partially covered, but the greater number were unannoyed by vestments of any description. Their eyes were black, piercing, and treacherous. Then the women, O ye gods! They exhibited short, dirty teeth, skin saturated with blubber, bandy legs, and a waddling gait.
The Indians are ignorant, abject, and debased by nature, whose minds are as incapable of instruction as their bodies are of labor. They have nothing in common with humanity but the form, and God has sent us to destroy them, as he did to the Israelites of old to similar tribes.
3 tribes dominated the cultural landscape of Oregon: the Wasco, the Warm Springs, and the Paiute. Each tribe spoke their own language and followed their own unique customs. The Warm Springs and Wasco tribes traded and conversed frequently, but the Paiute's language prevented them from frequent contact. By 1852, 12,000 settlers were crossing through the tribe's territories each year, and tension began to build to a fever pitch.
We have found that the white man and Indians cannot live together in peace, that it is better that lines should be drawn so that the white man will know where his land is and the Indian where his land is. We may then live without quarreling.
In the 1850s, Joel Palmer, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, was ordered to clear the natives from their land. He negotiated a series of 9 treaties with native tribes, including the Warm Springs and Wasco tribes, promising good farmland and access to their fishing stations on the Columbia River.
The whites are determined to settle on your land. We cannot prevent them, and in a few years there will be no place left for you. Then what will you do? Will you live in the mountains like wolves?
Palmer's promises proved to be hollow. The treaty the tribe signed relinquished 10 million acres of land to the United States and confined them to 640,000 acres of wild, untamed desert wilderness, miles from any access to the Columbia River. The two tribes were forced together, and years later Paiutes were relocated to the Warm Springs Reservation, despite their history of conflict with Columbia River tribes. The treaty also stipulated that the U.S. government provide the Warm Springs Reservation with a schoolhouse, teacher, and books. Through the 1860s, educational instruction on the reservation remained modest, due in part to limited funds. Over time, the schoolhouses would be the most destructive weapon the U.S. government would wield against Native Oregonians. Their primary purpose was to replace Native children's indigenous practices, language, and religious traditions, essentially erasing Native culture. As the state continued to grow and Native influence continued to shrink, another minority group's battle with racial prejudice in Oregon was only beginning.
Well, the first major wagon trains came out from Missouri in 1843, and the very first one was led by a fellow named Peter Burnett, and that's called the Great Migration. But you read the histories of these wagon trains, and almost nothing is mentioned about blacks or slaves. And almost every wagon train in those first 10 years had at least a handful of slaves and occasionally free blacks along with them. And so what was happening is the first wagon trains came out of Missouri, and people largely were from Missouri in that period. And Missouri, of course, was a slave state. And so many of these people were fleeing slavery. They didn't want any part of it. Because if you didn't have a slave in Missouri, then you were at a handicap against people who did have slaves if you were a farmer. But some of the people who did come out from Missouri were slaveholders. And the idea there was that in Oregon they were going to get up to a square mile of free land. And so the idea of having to cultivate a square mile of free land on your own or with a couple of your sons was pretty awesome. So many of them brought a couple of slaves out to get them started. So most of these folks who did bring slaves freed them after a few years, but there were some who didn't and who kept them for much longer.
Though the Oregon Trail was seen by many pioneers as an opportunity for a fresh start and a chance to escape competition with wealthy slave owners, it was also seen as an opportunity to escape black people entirely.
Unless a man keeps slaves, and I won't, he has no even chance. He cannot compete with the man who does. I'm going to Oregon, where there'll be no slaves, and we'll all start over.
They'd had this bad experience with slavery because of the difficulty of competing with slave owners who had slaves in Missouri. And so they wanted to come to a place where there wouldn't be slaves. They wouldn't have to compete with black labor. So they didn't want slaves here, period.
Peter Burnett became the first judge in the Oregon country. Born in Nashville, Tennessee, and raised by a family of slave owners, he came to the West to escape his substantial debts. He was elected to the Oregon Provisional Government's 7-member Provisional Council and enacted Oregon's first exclusion law against blacks.
The object is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population. We're in a new world, under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so much affected the United States and other countries.
Burnett's infamous law allowed slave owners to keep a slave up to 3 years before having to release the slave. Any free black man or woman caught in Oregon country could receive up to 38 lashes. Section 1. That slavery and involuntary servitude shall be forever prohibited in Oregon. Section 2. That in all cases where slaves have been or shall hereafter be brought into Oregon, the owner of such slaves shall have the term of 3 years from the introduction of such slaves to remove them out of the country. Section 3. That if such owner of slaves shall neglect or refuse to remove such slaves from the country within the time specified in the preceding section, such slaves shall be free. Section 6. That if any such free Negro or mulatto shall fail to quit the country as required by this act, he or she may be arrested by some justice of the peace, and if guilty upon trial before such justice, shall receive upon his or her bare back not less than 20 or more than 38 stripes, to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county. The lash law only lasted a year because it was deemed too harsh. In December 1844, the punishment for being black in Oregon was relaxed from lashing to forced labor. In 1846, the Oregon Treaty was signed between the U.S. and Britain. Britain gained all territory north of the 49th parallel, while the U.S. took sole possession of what is now known as Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and western parts of Montana and Wyoming. This area officially became the Oregon Territory on August 14, 1848, and 11 years later, Oregon became the 33rd state of the United States of America. Oregon was the first state to have both an anti-slavery law and an exclusion law against African Americans. In 1849, another exclusion law was passed, forbidding blacks to enter the state. Adding insult to injury, just 1 year later, the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850 granted a free half-square mile of land to white couples, explicitly excluding blacks and Hawaiians.
The exclusion laws obviously were important in the 1840s and 1850s, right up until the time of the Civil War. Then the Civil War amendments, including the 14th Amendment, sort of make those laws moot. But they don't necessarily make the attitudes moot. Essentially, there is the sense in Oregon that black folks aren't welcome.
By the end of the 1860s, the Civil War was over, and Oregon's identity as a white state was firmly established. An 1862 law had forbidden interracial marriages between blacks and whites in Oregon, and in 1870 the new 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote failed to pass in Oregon. While the country was celebrating its final victory over slavery, civil rights in Oregon seemed to be sliding backward. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, a new group of hard-working immigrants were looking to carve out their own future in the Oregon wilderness and the growing city of Portland.
But the largest number of Chinese came to work on the railroads, and they were actually recruited by the railroad builders, white railroad builders in the United States. And I think after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, when it was completed, of the 13,000 workers on the western portion of that railroad, 11,000 of them were Chinese, and they've received so little credit for their labor in constructing that part of the railroad through the Sierra Nevada, those granite cliffs which were such difficult to get through. But the success of the Chinese on that railroad then led to their working on railroads throughout the Northwest.
The relatively small population of Chinese miners in Oregon in the early 1860s had immigrated from the Pearl River Delta region in southeast China. Following the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese population in Oregon surged from several hundred in the 1860s to nearly 10,000 only 20 years later. Anti-Chinese sentiment flared quickly. As early as the 1870s, leaders within the state were calling for the expulsion of Chinese immigrants and the exclusion of further Chinese immigration to Oregon. In the 1880s, the boiling resentment against Chinese immigrants erupted into violence. 2 large buildings in Portland's Chinatown were set on fire by arsonists. 80 masked men raided a Chinese woodcutting camp near Albina. In 1887, a party of schoolboys and horse thieves from Wallowa ambushed and murdered over 30 Chinese miners working on the Snake River in the far northeastern corner of the state. Tortured and mutilated bodies were found floating in the Snake River, as far away as Lewiston, Idaho, 65 miles to the north. 1 year later, 6 men and boys were indicted by a grand jury for what is now known as the Hells Canyon Massacre. No one was ever punished for the crime. Beginning with the Page Act in 1878, which forbid Chinese women of immoral character to enter the country, the federal government began to officially curtail Chinese immigration to the United States. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act put a 10-year ban on the immigration of Chinese laborers. The practical effect was that all Chinese immigration was stopped. The law was renewed for another 10 years in 1892, and it was made permanent in 1902.
And so that's probably the only time that the United States has ever banned a particular racial group from coming to this country. Chinese were all already here, were allowed to stay. Many of them did eventually return to China. Others lived out their lives in these communities and eventually passed away. It's important to remember so many of the laborers who came out were bachelors. They didn't have families and didn't have children, in that period. So eventually they died out. What you see in the towns and around Oregon, in Pendleton, or in Lewiston, Idaho, Baker City, they all had large Chinatowns and temples, and those are virtually all gone now.
During this exclusion period, Chinese were ineligible for naturalization, excluded from public schools, prohibited from entering professions or serving on juries, disenfranchised, and forbidden interracial marriages. From 1900 to 1920, the thriving community of over 10,000 Chinese in Oregon quickly withered to only 3,000 and continued to decline. It would be over 3 decades before the community began to grow again. The Chinese weren't the only Asian immigrants to face discrimination in the Northwest. In Central Oregon, an infamous showdown took place between local white farmers and George Shima, a Japanese farming tycoon dubbed the Potato King of California. In what would have been the beginning of a small community of Japanese immigrants, Shima purchased over 13,000 acres of land in the Powell Butte area, turning them into a large potato farm. Shima hired mostly local white laborers, sending a small handful of Japanese farming experts from California to assist the operation. His Japanese employees arrived in Oregon to a wave of uneasiness and anxiety among white farmers.
While everyone welcomes the prospect of development indicated in the announcement of the purchase of a large acreage in the Powell Butte section to be devoted to the production of potatoes, the fact that a Japanese is one of the buyers suggests the possibility of a situation developing here. It is to be expected that George Shima will want to employ Japanese. If Japanese are brought in as ranch hands, it will be only a short time before they will be buying ranches for themselves.
Within months, anxiety had mushroomed into fear and direct opposition to the presence of Japanese farmers in the area.
We, the undersigned, hereby declare ourselves as unilaterally opposed to any Japanese yellow farmers coming in here either as laborers or so-called experts, or for any other occupation or vocation whatsoever.
In May 1920, local farmers held a commercial club meeting to discuss the issue and how to deal with George Burt, the head of the potato operation in Oregon.
As to Burt, we'll show him a juniper tree with a rope hung over a limb and see if he can take the hint.
Dumbfounded and insulted, Burt immediately sent a wire to the commercial club.
Am I to understand that your commercial club sanctioned remarks and threats made against life and property as published by F.E. Pellet? If so, please remember our land purchases and other operations in Central Oregon are in accordance with the laws of the United States and the state of Oregon. Furthermore, as a member of the San Francisco Commercial Club, I must ask you before you come to any definite conclusion that I or my associates be heard at your club meeting. I will be in Oregon shortly after June 1st.
The distressed locals decided to make a preemptive strike before Burt or Shima could turn the situation into a legal issue. On a workday in June 1920, 5 riders from Bend rode out to Powell Butte and terrorized the Japanese workers there, rounding them up, threatening them, and robbing at least one of them of $180, worth over $2,000 today. Central Oregon had struck the blow that would eventually bring an end to the operation. Over the following year, the community sank deeper into paranoia and self-delusion, convincing itself that it had not only saved itself from a dangerous outsider, but was also already doing its part to serve other minority groups in the area and live at peace with them.
That the people of Jefferson County are willing to bear their fair share of the white man's burden, there is no doubt. This is definitely proven by the Indian situation and their fair treatment of the Negro question, but it is too much to expect them to in any way tolerate Japanese residents in the county. We have no room for the yellow man, and we don't want them. We desire to see any and every white person reside or own land here and prosper, but it is not fair to expect that Oregon people will allow the condition to exist with the yellow people as it now does in California.
Barely able to keep his farmers from fleeing the ranch after the riders were gone, Bert would struggle on for another 2 years to save the operation, until Shima finally pulled all of his assets out of Oregon and put the acreage back on the market in 1922. A quarter of the 20th century was already gone, and Oregon was descending into its most unspeakable chapter of racism and prejudice yet. The KKK is the fastest growing organization the world has ever known, a purely patriotic American institution.
The Klan was particularly powerful in Texas. It was especially powerful in Georgia. It was powerful in Alabama and Louisiana and the places that one might expect, the old Confederate South. And it was especially powerful in Oregon. As a matter of fact, Oregon was the far western state where the Klan was most influential. And what do I mean by most influential? I mean that the Klan dominated politics so much so that it elected a governor for the state of Oregon. It elected a mayor for the city of Portland, and it pretty well dominated politics in places like Eugene and other major cities across the state.
In 1921, the KKK reached the largest size it had been to date. 15% of all white males were card-carrying members. Richard Butler, the founder of the Aryan Nation, saw the Pacific Northwest as a homeland for the KKK.
There are a lot of Confederate refugees from the South who I guess are attracted to Oregon not because they're racists, but because Oregon has a racial homogeneity and conservatism and a gun culture that they really appreciate.
Oregon experienced a unique phenomenon. It was the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan has gone through 3 phases. There was the phase in which it was created in 1866 in my home state of Tennessee, and that was the phase in which the Klan was noted for violence against African Americans connected to Reconstruction activities, including most likely voting. Then the Klan faded. A new Klan arose in, I would say, 1914, 1915, with the emergence of a movie called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation electrified, and that's no pun intended, electrified the nation. It was the first major motion picture to be produced in Hollywood. It literally had a cast of thousands. It was the first Hollywood production to claim a cast of thousands. There were black extras, but there were no leading characters in the movie who were African American. All of the leading characters were white actors in blackface. But perhaps worse, Birth of the Nation stirred up a whole lot of old animosities that had died down and promoted new stereotypes in a huge way. Essentially, it said that Reconstruction was a failure because African Americans were uneducated and not ready for the vote. And it essentially argued that the earlier Klan arose in response to the lack of preparedness on the part of African Americans for the vote or for civic participation. And that Klan had to forcibly eliminate blacks from the political process. Well, that kind of rhetoric, especially when it's shown on the screen and millions of people see it all over the country. For instance, President Woodrow Wilson said it was history written with lightning when it was shown in the White House in 1915. That kind of movie galvanized what was already percolating in American society, a new wave of racism, racist sentiment. Nativist sentiment against immigrants, and certainly sentiment against African Americans and various other groups of color. All of that came to a head with the rise of a new Klan, the second Ku Klux Klan, which emerged in the early 1920s. That Klan, for the first time, moved out of the South. The original Klan was essentially a Southern phenomenon. The new Klan was a nationwide phenomenon. There was one Klan demonstration in 1925, 10,000 Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with the Capitol Dome in the background. Think of that image. The Ku Klux Klan is a powerful force in American politics, so powerful that they could march down Pennsylvania Avenue en masse and essentially be at the heart or be at the seat of American political power in the country at the time.
As the Klan surged through the United States, its presence was perhaps felt most powerfully in Oregon, the state with the most Klan members per capita in the country. 14,000 statewide members, with 9,000 in Portland.
The Klan limits its Americanism to native-born, the white, the Gentile, and the non-Catholic.
The Klan played a pivotal part in the 1922 race for governor in Oregon. The Compulsory Education Act, a bill that required all children in the state to attend public schools, was drafted by the KKK to kill private Catholic and Jewish schools in Oregon. Incumbent Governor Ben Olcott had refused to endorse the Klan or their education bill, and the Klan threw everything they had behind Democratic challenger Walter M. Pierce, who had agreed to back the bill. Pierce won by over 30,000 votes, and the Compulsory Education Act was passed by 12,000 votes. All private education was suspended in Oregon until the Supreme Court struck down the act 3 years later.
One of the pictures, I guess, that is both compelling and embarrassing all at the same time is a picture that's widely seen of Klan members in Portland, fully robed, shaking hands with local politicians, and the sign behind them says, "Jesus saves." So here you have this action going on in a church, okay, which is completely the opposite of what these religious people, the Christians, say they believe. So how can you allow this to happen here? And it's something as simple as that. We can look at that now and say, that's just crazy. Well, we should be asking the same things of ourselves now. What are we doing right now that's just crazy?
When Birth of a Nation opened in 1915, it enjoyed top billing at the Grand Theater in Bend. In the 20s, while the Klan was electing governors and mayors in Portland, it was hard at work preserving racial uniformity in Central Oregon. The Bend Bulletin published article after article about the Klan's activities in Bend throughout the 20s, including a story about the chilling day when the Klan practically brought the town to a standstill. Ceremonies of the Ku Klux Klan were held last night on Pilot Butte, following a parade of Klansmen in automobiles through the streets of Bend. The parade passed south of Wall Street, down Franklin to Congress, and east on Delaware. The parade halted for several minutes at the Klan's headquarters on Hill Street, then proceeded east on Greenwood Avenue and out the road to the Butte. At the bottom of the road up the Butte, a sentry car had already been placed. One of those standing there was Justice of the Peace, E.D. Gilson, wearing a Klansman's robe. Shortly after the first of the cars reached the summit, the flaming cross, which has been seen on 2 previous occasions, appeared on the west side of the Butte. The cross was lighted a few minutes before 9 o'clock and was still burning at 10:30. The KKK burned at least 4 crosses on the Butte in the early 1920s. They didn't go unopposed in Bend, though. Local Catholic priest Father Luke Sheehan, who founded St. Francis Church and St. Charles Hospital, actively opposed the Klan, interrupting Klan meetings, pinning articles in the Bend Bulletin, and generally stirring up the right kind of trouble.
I could never understand why any American would have to hide his face to do and accomplish those things which make for Americanism in his own country.
In his own David meets Goliath moment, Father Luke stood up to argue with itinerant pastor and speaker R.H. Sawyer, who had rented out the Liberty Theater to defend the Klan's mission and efforts in Oregon. He was nearly forcibly ejected by 2 Klansmen in robes, until Sawyer intervened and stopped them. Local tradition is that the Central Oregon Klan released its pressure on the Catholic Church after Father Luke's stand. Even though the KKK didn't last long in Central Oregon, their influence lingered for years. In 1925, white trade-only signs began to appear in the windows of many Bend establishments, and for the next 4 decades, burning crosses on the butte would continue to be the community's symbolic reaction to any progress made by a minority in Bend. The relatively concerted effort throughout Oregon to discourage and prevent people of color from engaging in commerce, buying property, or working the land was successful. Racial diversity remained virtually non-existent throughout the state until 1941, when the demands of the war effort finally unbalanced the status quo.
May 1942 in the Coral Sea, our Navy successfully blocked the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby and helped prepare the way for a decisive American success at Midway. There, Army, Navy, and Marine flyers would be among the first to distinguish themselves in the Pacific fighting.
One of the farthest-reaching demographic effects of the war was the beginning of the Great Migration of agricultural workers from Mexico into the U.S. In 1942, desperate to backfill the agricultural labor force that had been emptied for the war effort, the U.S. government launched the Mexican Labor Program, an agreement negotiated with the Mexican government to bring workers into the U.S. The program brought 15,000 Mexican workers to Oregon, many of whom worked in Central Oregon. The program guaranteed workers fair wages and housing, but oversight was poor in the Northwest, and negligence and abuse of the program by greedy employers was commonplace. Northwest workers staged strikes to improve their living situation and income, but had little success. Ever since the end of World War II, social and political tension regarding Mexican immigration has plagued the U.S., and Oregon is no exception. Though Mexican migrant workers were recruited by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government failed to keep its side of the arrangement, immigrants from Mexico are often treated or spoken of as an invasive community, threatening American jobs and interests on our soil. The Mexican immigrant community has remained a fixture of Oregon's cultural landscape, along with other minority community that exploded to life during World War II.
The next big influx of blacks into Oregon came with the shipyards in the 1940s. Again, you had the recruiting of blacks out of the South to come to Oregon for these jobs, because at that time, of course, Henry Kaiser had pretty much established the Portland as the West Coast center for shipbuilding to support the war effort. And so at one point you had the Kaiser shipyards going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You had people on these rotating ships, men and women from all over the United States. A large group of blacks, though, coming out of the South. Again, when you think about what an opportunity this was, because when you think about what life was like for blacks in the 40s in the South, you still have people being hung, people that can't get good jobs, and now they have an opportunity to come all the way west, again, not really having roots there, but feeling at least they could make a living in a different place and perhaps escape all of this racism and segregation and things that were going on in the South.
At first, blacks weren't hired in the Kaiser yards. Eventually, they were. Ultimately, railroad trains were dispatched to the east to bring African Americans and white workers out to the Kaiser shipyards. To show you the importance of the Kaiser shipyards in terms of the African American community, at one point, some 90% of the blacks who were working in Portland were working at the yards. That's men and women. That's how important the Kaiser yards were. And of course, one of the consequences of the Kaiser yards was the creation of Vanport, which wasn't a black community, but it was, at that moment, the second largest city in Oregon. And it was created mainly to accommodate Kaiser workers who were working in Vancouver or who were working in the various Kaiser facilities elsewhere in Portland. And so the bottom line is that whatever Oregon's reputation was before that point, all of a sudden Kaiser is calling, and remember, Kaiser is paying better wages than almost any industrial firm in the world at that time. And so Kaiser is calling for workers. Workers respond, black and white, many instances black and white workers from the same towns in the South. And they make their way to Oregon. And the Oregon population increases dramatically. Portland's black population goes from about 1,600 to 22,000. 22,000 in about 3 years.
The Kaiser shipyard was far from a paradise. Work was hard. In September 1942, the 10,500-ton Liberty ship Joseph N. Teal was built in 10 days. Discrimination was rampant. The Portland Boilermakers, a local union, refused to allow entry to black workers, then tried to use their failure to pay union dues to bar them from working in the yards.
When a Negro had gone to work for the Kaiser Company, no matter how satisfactory his work, the Union Council compelled his ouster merely by filing notice that he was not paid up in his dues, and he could not pay his dues for the simple reason he could not join the Union at all.
The poor whites and blacks working in the shipyard settled in Vanport, which sprawled into the second largest city in Oregon, reaching 40,000 people at its height. It was one of only 2 places blacks were allowed to live in the Portland area, and a thriving black community sprang to life, complete with baseball teams, theaters, and restaurants. When the war ended and the shipyards dramatically reduced their output, over half of Vanport's residents moved away to look for work elsewhere. Still, it looked like black culture finally had a foothold in the white state and was here to stay. But tragedy was just over the horizon. The city of Vanport was the largest public housing project in U.S. history when it was constructed. Over 10,000 fiberboard dwellings were clapped together in 110 days in 1942, surrounded on all sides by little more than railroad embankments to shelter the town from the Columbia River's seasonal ebb and flow.
The psychological effect of living on the bottom of a relatively small area, diked on all sides to a height of 15 to 25 feet, was vaguely disturbing. It was almost impossible to get a view of the horizon from anywhere in Vanport.
In 1948, a particularly wet year in Oregon, the population of Vanport had shrunk drastically, and little had been done to improve the infrastructure of the half-empty city. A warm, rainy spring blasted the snow-packed mountains, and the Columbia and Willamette rivers both swelled to calamitous heights, nearly 10 feet over their normal flood stage. The worried citizens of Vanport began to clamor for guidance and protection from the Portland government. On Memorial Day 1948, the Housing Authority of Portland issued this statement to the citizens of Vanport. Remember, dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited. The Housing Authority of Portland had been assured by the U.S. Corps of Engineers that the so-called dikes would hold. The Housing Authority was convinced enough to continue reassuring the citizens of Vanport that everything would be fine, but not convinced enough to stay in Vanport. Their files and equipment were removed from their Vanport offices, along with 600 horses from the racetrack next door. At 4:17 p.m., disaster struck. When the first dike broke, a 10-foot wall of water washed through the city, and 1 hour later the entire town was buried. The foundationless homes were either torn apart in the torrent or buoyed on top of the water and carried away. Over a dozen people were reported dead. 18,000 people were suddenly homeless, including most of the black population of Oregon. Rumors that the Housing Authority deliberately withheld flood warnings as well as underreported the death toll persist to this day. The Realty Board had passed a code of ethics which prohibited offering housing loans to minorities for homes in white neighborhoods. So over 6,000 displaced blacks from Vanport were in need of a new home. With Vanport gone, there was only one other place blacks were allowed to live in Portland, the Albina neighborhood. The white leadership of Portland was left wondering what effect the large influx of African Americans would have on the city.
And so when you read the newspaper accounts, I mean, it was just, what are we going to do with all these black people? You know, that's when the real fear started to surface, because it was kind of okay when they were over there in Vanport. They were kind of contained, they were working, not a problem. Now you got these people that are black people coming into Portland. They don't have a job because, you know, they don't have housing.
10 years after the Vanport flood, 23,000 whites had fled Albina, and 7,000 more blacks had moved in. Albina had transformed into a vibrant black cultural center, though the city of Portland saw something else.
The other thing that changed everything in Portland was, we'll call it the kind of the progress that started to happen right after World War II. The rebuilding of infrastructure and new infrastructure. In this case, the I-5, the whole I-5 corridor. Well, when you look at the history of blacks in Portland, that whole, all of those type of projects, renewal projects is what they call them, became an excuse, if you will, to really get rid of that whole black neighborhood that had become built during, you know, dating back from the railroads and up through World War II. And so a lot of that area then was classified as blighted. But if you take a look at the pictures of the homes that were there versus the pictures of homes that were at other places, you don't see much difference there. And if you look at all the redlining that was done during that time, they basically forced those people out of those homes. I know people right now that live in Portland who can tell you exactly where their families lived. And sometimes, even though it was supposed to be in the name of progress, you would have, for example, I-5 coming through there. And of course, everybody wanted a highway, super highway to go through Portland. You had Emmanuel Hospital, and of course, who can argue with the need to have a hospital, a large major hospital in Portland. You had Memorial Coliseum, which initially was called Veterans Memorial Coliseum. Again, kind of another, what you call it, kind of advertising, marketing ploy to make it palatable to everybody. Certainly, who's going to say we don't want to have a place to honor veterans? We just come out of World War II, you know. So all of these places and the building of them became an excuse really to really demolish the whole black community that had grown up in Portland.
300 homes were destroyed to make room for Emmanuel Hospital. 476 homes were destroyed to make room for Memorial Coliseum, which would become the home of the Portland Trailblazers.
Was it urban renewal or Negro removal? And when you look at the plans that were being laid, you know, even back during World War II, about what would happen after the war, you look at some of the planning documents, there is a whole tone in there about what's going to happen when we're not at war anymore. Where are these people going to go? How are they going to be housed? What are we going to do with them in Portland? So, you know, and that, frankly, is a story that we're still living it. Because now, in these same areas where there was a black community and another type of black community started to evolve, now it's changed again under the guise of gentrification. So some of the blacks who were living in that area that were trying to get loans, you know, either to rebuild their businesses or to buy homes and stuff, and couldn't get them for any number of reasons, but primarily based on race and redlining, those kinds of things. Suddenly you've got new people coming in, and I guess they're like the hipster generation now, for lack of a better term, that are getting these loans. And so now these bright new buildings, bright new businesses are popping up in what was the old black community in Portland. And so I can really understand now when I talk to black people who lived in Portland for a long time, the level of resentment that is present today in Portland because they know that history. And that history, you don't have to look back very far to see, what happened there, and it's still happening.
The effects and evidence of our past are still with us. One glaring example of this are the racist names that still dot the geographical landscape of Oregon.
There still exists across the state a lot of areas that were named for Black people, and I don't mean Sally Jones. I think they're in the teens right now. They're still relics of the past where places were named nigger this, nigger that, all across the state. We did a whole documentary, a short documentary really, about a canyon out in Central Oregon, which was originally called Nigger Canyon and then was subsequently changed to Negro Canyon. And after some research was done, come to find out the man who owned this property, we have his name, John A. Brown.
Oregon's sordid racial past isn't the end of the story. Our founders' legacy lives on in the affected lives of generations of people of color.
You can think of all the things that weren't mentioned, all the crimes against people that were committed where nobody reported it, nobody was a witness to it. After Generation 2, these things are totally forgotten. And then it just makes me think about all the things that probably happened to people of color, Chinese, Hawaiians, Native Americans, that just were never reported, never recorded. And they were there. Because they were there because of things that we do know, we do have fragments about.